Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Racism, a Very Short Introduction by Rattansi, narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Preface to the second edition. In the conclusion to the first edition of this book, I argued that a long struggle between attempts to create post-ethnic, post-national, post-racial cosmopolitan frameworks and identities and more backward-looking projects is going to be a continuing feature of life in the 21st century. My informed hunch has unfortunately proved to be only too correct. This second, revised edition brings the narratives and dangers of racism up to date. In the process, most of the book has been rewritten to take into account events since 2006, when I first wrote the book. I have also incorporated important developments in the analysis of racism. Several themes from the first edition continue as threads throughout this second edition. The emphasis on the varying degree of ambivalence and contradiction in racist identities, and my argument for the indispensability of the concept of racialization in the analysis of racism. Also, as will become clear in the text, I continue to believe that racism is multidimensional. Moreover, it evolves to insinuate itself effectively in cultures of discrimination, so that simple, supposedly watertight definitions of racism and diagnoses that pin the label racist on individuals and institutions hinder rather than help in understanding how minorities and outsiders are racialized and how institutional cultures and procedures continue to discriminate. Indeed, this is precisely where the concept of racialization becomes particularly useful. These insights help to clarify, to take 4 illustrations that are discussed later, why certain types of Islamophobia might be regarded as forms of racism, why intersectionality is important, how a form of colorblind racism often prevails, and why a narrow definition of racism lacks the suppleness to grasp how issues such as national populism and nativism carry a deeper racial charge than is often understood, even by those who are regarded as experts in the analysis of right-wing national populism. I end with some significant considerations about recent developments in genomic science as well as the rise of right-wing national populism. Developments following the decoding of the human genome have led to quite astonishing leaps in our understanding of how significant the mixing of populations has been in the past, so that inhabitants who make nativist claims within particular territories have seldom been the first or original settlers, thus comprehensively undermining these nativist narratives. Furthermore, DNA analysis of the remains of the oldest known Briton, who lived around 10,000 years ago, known as Cheddar Man because his remains were discovered in Cheddar Gorge in the southwest of England, has confirmed that early settlers in Europe had dark skins, dark enough for them to be classified in contemporary terms as black. This is in keeping with the well-established finding that the first modern humans developed in Africa and then spread out across the rest of the planet. However, this completely overturns the way in which Europeans have usually claimed that to belong to Europe, individuals have to be white, as well as the notion that in the final instance, to be genuinely American too, whiteness is essential. The recovery and analysis of ancient DNA also has serious implications for claims by Hindu nationalists, for example, that the Indian Hindu population has some sort of essential, original purity. Indeed, there are no pure biological populations. We are all the product of multiple migrations and mixtures. Europeans even contain some amount of Neanderthal DNA. These issues are discussed in Chapter 3. By now, millions of easily available DNA testing kits have been sold. In a world in which migrations are on the increase, but walls and other impediments to movement are also being built, there is an understandable desire on the part of individuals to fix their biological origins and their identities, and hope that DNA analysis will provide some sense of belonging. However, they may unwittingly add to the danger that biology is once again beginning to trump culture in the understanding of identity, allowing a space into which newer versions of biological, scientific racism can now reinsert themselves. Moreover, we once again find ourselves in a time, as we did 100 years ago, when a serious understanding of race and racism is urgent and may become even more important. I hope that this book contributes to the kind of clarity we need in a world in which populations are once again obsessed with seeking and defending purity and natural, essential identities. We have been here before, except that now racial claims are increasingly being cloaked in notions like nativism and the pure, authentic, or genuine people. The rise of right-wing national populism carries dangers that were last seen in the rise of Nazism and other forms of fascism, which we thought would never happen again. They are discussed in Chapter 7. Of course, contemporary circumstances are different from the 1920s and 1930s, and the rise of national populism will no doubt play out differently, but there is little doubt that what seemed unimaginable just a few years ago is now coming to pass. The foundations of liberal democracies, even in countries where they have been well established, are experiencing an erosion of many fundamental institutional checks and balances against authoritarian rule. Racist forces have been emboldened by the rise of this right-wing authoritarianism, reflected in increased hate speech, especially in the new social media, but also in physical assaults against racialized ethnic minorities. In no other time since the defeat of the Nazis have public racist proclamations and violent racist attacks been more on the move from the margins to the mainstream in many parts of the global North and the global South. This second edition is published at a timely moment in the seemingly never-ending saga of racism. Chapter 1. Race and Racism. Some Conundrums. The term racism was coined in the 1930s, primarily as a response to the Nazi project of making Germany Judenrein, or free of Jews. The Nazis were in no doubt that Jews were a distinct race that posed a threat to the Aryan race to which authentic Germans supposedly belonged. With hindsight, it is possible to see that many of the dilemmas that have accompanied the proliferation of the notion of racism were present from the beginning. The idea that Jews were a distinct race was given currency by Nazi racial science, but before that, there was little consensus that Jews were a distinct race. Does that make it inappropriate to describe the long-standing hostility toward Jews in Christian Europe as racist? Or is it the case that racism has to be seen as a broader phenomenon that has long been a part of human history? Indeed, is it part of human nature? Something does not necessarily require technical or scientifically accepted definitions of race to be identified as racism. After all, it can be argued that the Nazi project was only one stage in a very long history of anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism is one of the oldest racisms, indeed the longest hatred, as it has been called. However, complications immediately arise. The term anti-Semitism only came into being in the late 1870s when the German Wilhelm Marr used it to characterize his anti-Jewish movement, the Anti-Semitic League, and specifically to differentiate his project from earlier, more diffuse forms of Christian anti-Judaism, more popularly known as Judenhass, or Jew hatred. His was a self-conscious racism that required the Jews be defined as a distinct race, and anti-Semitism had the advantage of sounding like a new, scientific concept separate from simple religious bigotry. Thus, the key assertion of his little book was that Semitic racial, that is, biological, traits were systematically associated with the Jewish character, their culture and behavior. Jews, according to Marr, could not help but be materialistic and scheming, and these traits meant an inevitable clash with German racial culture, which could not be anything but idealistic and generous. Marr entitled his pamphlet The Victory of the Jews over the Germans, because he thought that German racial characteristics meant that Germans would be unable to resist being completely overwhelmed by Jewish cunning. He blamed his own loss of a job on Jewish influence. This is one particular form of hard or classical racism in which biology and culture are intertwined in a form in which biological features are inevitably accompanied by cultural traits in particular populations. Was Marr justified in insisting or distinguishing his version of anti-Jewishness from other historical forms? Is racism, properly so called, something distinct from the hostility that many would argue is a universal form of suspicion of all strangers and those who have distinct cultural identities? It is, after all, not uncommon to hear the view that Jews have been particularly prone to victimization because of their own attempts to retain a distinct identity and their refusal to assimilate, one version of the so-called Jewish problem, a type of argument that is often used against other ethnic minorities in European nation-states. The underlying logic of this sort of viewpoint is that racism is simply part of a continuum that includes, at one end, perfectly understandable and benign collective identifications that are essential for the survival of all cultural groups. At the other end, the Holocaust and other genocides are therefore to be regarded as unfortunate but inevitable episodes, varying in superficial ways but united by an essential similarity stemming from the very nature of humans as biological and cultural beings who live only in groups, are held together by common feelings of identity, and are thus impelled to maintain their collective identities. Also, the idea of making the German nation Judenrein seems close to the notion that has now come to be called ethnic cleansing. But is all ethnic cleansing racist? Or is there something distinctive about racist acts of hatred, expulsion, and violence? In which case, how exactly are we to distinguish between hostility based on ethnicity and that based on race? What is the difference between an ethnic group and a race? To put it somewhat differently, but making the same point, should we distinguish between ethnocentrism and racism? It is clear that even the briefest inquiry into the meaning of the term racism throws up a number of perplexing questions and various cognate terms: ethnicity and ethnocentrism, nation, nationalism, and xenophobia, hostility to outsiders and strangers, often called heterophobia, and so forth, which require clarification. To complicate matters even more, it is worth remembering that historically there has been an ambiguity surrounding Jewish whiteness, which still persists to some degree. As we will see, the whiteness of Jews, especially in the USA, as of Italians and the Irish too, has actually been gradually achieved in the 20th century as part of a social and political process of inclusion. As Semites, but also as Orientals, Jews were often regarded as not belonging to white races, while it was not uncommon in the 19th century for the English and Americans to regard the Irish as black, and for Italians to have an ambiguous status between white and black in the USA. But who is to count as black? The history of U.S. debates and legislation reveals consistent difficulties in defining the black population. A famous one-drop rule was adopted in many southern states, which implied that any black ancestry, however far back, consigned an individual to the wrong side of the white-black divide, determining and disadvantaging where he could live, what kind of work was available, and whether marriage or even relationships could take place with a white partner. One drop of white blood, though, did not carry the same weight in assigning racial status. The idea of racism is obviously closely tied to the concept of race, but it should be clear by now that the more one delves into the history of both notions, the more puzzling they turn out to be. Several important points emerge from considering the examples of Jews and the Irish, and some of the other groups that are discussed later. First, the idea of race contains both biological and cultural elements, for example, skin color, religion, and behavior. Second, the biological and cultural appear to combine in variable proportions in any definition of a racial group, depending upon the group and the historical period in question. And racial status, as in the whitening of Jews, the Irish, and others, is subject to political negotiation and transformation. Inevitably, therefore, the term racism has also become subject to social forces and political conflict. The idea of race was in retreat in the second half of the 20th century in the aftermath of the defeat of Nazism and discoveries in the science of genetics, although the 21st century has seen unconvincing attempts to revive the notion. Nowadays, there is a tendency to regard intercommunal hostilities as stemming from issues of cultural rather than racial difference, except on the very far right and among some who, misleadingly, base their assertions on recent biomedical research. Many commentators argue that the justification of hostility and discrimination on grounds of culture rather than race is mostly a rhetorical ploy to get around the taboo against racism that has gradually been established, especially in Western liberal democracies. There is, they contend, a new cultural racism that has increasingly supplanted an older biological racism. Islamophobia has been identified as one of the most recent forms of this new racism. But can a combination of religious and other cultural antipathy be described as racist? Is this not to rob the idea of racism of any analytical specificity and open the floodgates to a conceptual inflation that simply undermines the legitimacy of the idea? These issues are discussed later in the book. Fewer and fewer people in Western societies will nowadays openly describe themselves as racist. Yet social scientists, politicians, journalists, and members of various communities are apt to claim that these societies are deeply racist. Government agencies continue to collect statistical and other evidence of racial discrimination and use a variety of laws and other instruments to attempt to enforce non-discriminatory codes of conduct. In Britain, considerable controversy was ignited in 1999 when the inquiry by Sir William Macpherson into the murder of the black teenager Stephen Lawrence concluded that the London Metropolitan Police was institutionally racist, thus propelling yet another definition into the public domain. This has been only one in a whole series of other investigations that have documented systematic and long-standing discrimination against Britain's ethnic minorities in spheres such as housing, private and public sector employment, and so forth. To take instances from studies on UK medical staff, on 5 September 2018, the UK Guardian newspaper published findings from research that white senior doctors earned almost £5,000 more than colleagues from minority ethnic backgrounds. A 2014 study, titled The Snowy White Peaks of the NHS, carried out by the Middlesex University Business School, exposed the absence of British minority ethnic, BME, representation in higher-level posts in the National Health Service, NHS, while a national review by the NHS in 2016 reported that much higher proportions of BME medical staff reported cases of harassment, bullying, and abuse. This follows a Bradford University study which surveyed 80 NHS trusts between June 2008 and November 2009, and found that BME staff were nearly twice as likely to face disciplinary procedures than their white counterparts. See the BBC News article titled "Institutional Racism is an Issue in NHS," says Executive, 7 November 2012, although the Department of Health is reported to have said that the NHS was not institutionally racist. Research by the King's Fund and what is known as the Race Equality Foundation and other related organizations has revealed that black and Asian British citizens receive worse treatment compared with whites as patients of the NHS, and that this is especially true in the case of mental health services. Although these findings and events have been greeted with disbelief in some quarters, to many this came as no surprise. As reported in the British Medical Journal, BMJ, on 5 March 1988, a Commission for Racial Equality investigation had already revealed that London's highly respected St. George's Hospital Medical School's admission procedures had unwittingly inscribed into the school's computer software a systematic penalty against British applicants with non-European sounding surnames, as well as against females. The report in the BMJ points out that the computer program had incorporated a bias that was already in the system, that is, such discriminatory practices on the grounds of ethnic origin and sex had been normally implemented by staff before the computer program was written in an attempt to simplify and speed up admissions procedures. The BMJ rightly argues that such attitudes cannot be excused. The process has been revised to give all applicants a fair chance. The issue of the exclusion of ethnic minorities from top-ranking universities in the UK, especially Oxford and Cambridge, has assumed prominence in debates about racial inequality in the period since 2010. Moreover, on 6 July 2019, The Guardian newspaper published findings from its Freedom of Information requests to 131 British universities, revealing that in the previous 5 years, at least 996 formal complaints regarding racism had been made by staff and students. A total of 367 were upheld, resulting in at least 78 student suspensions or exclusions and 51 suspensions, dismissals, and resignations by staff. The authors of the Guardian article, David Batty and Sally Wheel, claim that there were grounds to believe that these figures underestimate the scale of racism in universities because many students and staff were dissuaded from making complaints, or were persuaded to drop them or agreed to a more informal resolution. In the USA, the pervasive white domination of Oscar nominations in the film industry has aroused controversy as another indication of issues around racism. Both Oxbridge and the USA have experienced movements to knock down statues. In the former, of the racist colonialist Cecil Rhodes, and in the latter those of Confederate generals who wanted to uphold slavery as an ongoing institution. In March 2017, the UK government published a race disparity audit, which, among other things, showed that the rate of stop and search by police in 2016 through 17 among black people was 29 for every 1,000, while that for whites was 4 per 1,000. On the other hand, from 2007 through 8 to 2015 through 16, the percentage of black and other ethnic minority students among the total students in British universities increased from 17.2% to 22.9%, while for white students the figure fell from 82.8% to 77.1%. However, these gross figures hide the wide disparity between the entry of ethnic minorities and white entry into the top universities in the UK, as well as the class and gender disparities within both groups, thus requiring a more differentiated examination of these gross statistics. They hide as much as they reveal. What role racism plays in the variety of disparities in policing and education is a complex matter. Note that in Germany, revulsion against the Nazi pass has meant that xenophobia, Ausländerfeindlichkeit, rather than racism is the preferred term in German public discourse, raising yet more questions. Obviously, the relationship between xenophobia and racism requires clarification, especially as the issue of immigration has animated the rise of far-right parties all over Europe. In the USA, of course, there are continuing examples of controversy over race and racism, over and above the question of statues of Confederate generals. The election of President Trump in November 2016 was, in part, attributed by his opponents to his so-called dog-whistle racism against ethnic minorities and immigrants, especially of Mexican and Muslim origin. In July 2019, President Trump's tweets arguing that 4 Democratic congresswomen of color, 3 of whom had been born in the USA and 1 who had arrived as a child refugee, should go back home was condemned by the Democrat-controlled House of Representatives as racist. Over 2 decades ago, 2 criminal trials revealed an American population strongly divided on black-white lines. Prior to his trial and consideration of the evidence by the jury, O.J. Simpson, a well-known sportsman, was believed by most white people to be guilty and most African Americans not guilty of the murder of his white wife. He was acquitted. The acquittal in a state court of 4 white police officers seen on camera beating a black motorist, Rodney King, led to widespread race rioting in Los Angeles in 1992. A federal trial led to the conviction of 2 of the officers. The more recent death of black American citizens, such as Eric Garner on 17 July 2014, at the hands of police officers in the second decade of the 21st century, has sparked widespread revulsion and has now given rise to considerable anger and the development of the Black Lives Matter movement, although it is worth noting that African Americans are much more likely to attribute the killings to racism than white Americans. The Black Lives Matter movement has also been involved in publicizing the fact that 1 in 9 African American males between the ages of 20 and 34 are in prison, and indeed are more likely to be incarcerated than to be attending college. The U.S. Department of Justice confirmed in 2014 that the majority of male prisoners between the ages of 30 and 39 are black, with Hispanics making up 2% and whites 1%. The likelihood of a black man spending time in prison at some point in his life is 1 in 3, while for Hispanic men it is 1 in 6, and for white men it is 1 in 17. One consequence is that African Americans are disproportionately disenfranchised, as many states in the USA are especially punitive in denying voting rights to those convicted of felonies. Moreover, as reported by the American Death Penalty Information Center, defendants convicted of killing whites are considerably more likely to be sentenced to death than defendants convicted of killing blacks. The center also reports studies which show that the odds of receiving a death sentence are nearly 4 times higher if the defendant is black. In one form or another, then, the issue of race is very much alive, not only in the UK and the USA, but also Western and Eastern Europe. Chapter 2. Imperialism, Genocide, and the Science of Race. The term race entered English early in the 16th century. This was also the time when the term was acquiring currency in other European languages. For example, raça or race in French, razza in Italian, or raça in Portuguese, and razza in Spanish. By the middle of the 16th century, one common meaning was beginning to gain ground. Race began to refer to family, lineage, and breed. The term had particularly come to signify continuity over generations in aristocratic and royal families. The concept of race that we have inherited is also a modern idea, with different origins, but whose meaning was bolted onto this early usage. It was primarily born out of the encounters of white European travelers with darker-skinned peoples outside Europe from the 15th century onwards. 1492. When Columbus set out on his momentous journey to what he thought was Asia, the significance of the year 1492 was not lost on him, for this was the year that both Muslims and Jews were expelled from Spain. He wrote at the head of the first journal of his travels, "In this present year 1492, after your highnesses have brought to an end the war against the Moors, in this very month your highnesses determined to send me to the said regions of India. Thus, after having driven all the Jews out of your realms and dominions, your highnesses commanded me to set out with a sufficient armada to India." The year that is often regarded as marking the birth of Western modernity was one symbolized by the expulsion of internal others and the beginning of the conquest and pillage of those beyond the Christian, civilized world. The significance of the fact that the modern era can be said to begin with forms of racial aggression should not be lost on us. The modernity inaugurated by the voyages has yet to escape fully the shadows cast by the conquests of Spain and the Americas. The Indians discover Columbus. The shores on which Columbus landed, as we now know, were far from the Indies, but he was convinced that he had found what he was looking for. The Caribs and Arawaks who occupied the islands Columbus chanced upon were sophisticated peoples. They were familiar with agriculture, could make pottery of various designs, and were skilled mariners. Columbus, though, saw a primitive people, unclothed and dark, and therefore close to nature and uncivilized, and he had come looking for gold and to spread the word of the Christian God. Race, nature.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?